Dr. Michael Hayes adjusted his reading glasses as he sorted through another box of deteriorating photographs in the basement archives of the Millfield County Historical Society. The musty Kansas building held decades of forgotten memories, but this particular collection had arrived just last week from an estate sale. Most were typical rural family portraits from the early 1900s, stiff poses, formal clothing, weathered faces marked by hard prairie life. Then he found it. The photograph was remarkably well preserved for being over a century old. A family of 5 stood proudly in front of a modest farmhouse, the vast Kansas plains stretching endlessly behind them. The father, tall and lean with calloused hands, had his arm around a woman in a simple cotton dress. 3 children completed the scene, a baby cradled in the mother's arms, a serious-looking boy of about 12, and a young girl with blonde curls. Hayes studied the image more closely. Unlike the typically somber expressions common in photographs of that era, this family was smiling, genuinely smiling. The parents beamed with obvious pride. The boy grinned widely, and the little girl... Hayes paused. Something about her expression seemed different. While the others' smiles appeared natural and joyful, hers held an odd quality he couldn't quite place. On the back, someone had written in faded ink, "Morrison family, summer 1921, our beautiful children." Hayes set the photograph aside, intending to digitize it later. As a historian specializing in early 20th century rural communities, he'd learned that seemingly ordinary family portraits often held extraordinary stories. The afternoon sun streamed through the basement windows, casting long shadows across the archive tables. Outside, the modern world of Millfield continued its daily rhythm, unaware that a century-old secret was about to surface. Hayes gathered his materials, the Morrison photograph tucked safely in his research folder. Something told him this particular family had a story worth investigating. What he couldn't have known was that their secret had been hiding in plain sight for over 100 years, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. 3 days later, Hayes sat in his home office, methodically scanning the estate sale photographs into high-resolution digital files. The Morrison family portrait was among the last in the stack. As the scanner hummed to life, he found himself drawn once again to that peculiar smile on the young girl's face. The digital file appeared on his monitor in crisp detail. Hayes began his standard archival process, adjusting contrast and brightness to preserve historical accuracy. Modern scanning technology could reveal details invisible to the naked eye, often uncovering hidden elements that provided valuable historical context. He zoomed in on the family members one by one, taking notes. The father's weathered hands suggested years of agricultural work. The mother's dress, while simple, showed careful mending, evidence of the economic hardships following World War I. The baby appeared healthy and well-fed, unusual for rural families during those difficult times. Then he focused on the young girl. Emma, according to his preliminary research. Her blonde curls were neatly arranged, her dress clean and pressed. But that smile? Hayes increased the magnification further. There was something unsettling about her expression, a coldness that seemed inconsistent with childhood innocence. As he adjusted the image contrast, something caught his attention. Emma's right hand, partially hidden by the folds of her dress, appeared to be clutching something small. Hayes zoomed in further, his pulse quickening. The object was tiny, almost negligible, but definitely there. He enhanced the image resolution and adjusted the lighting parameters. Slowly, the object became clearer. It was small, white, and appeared to have a distinctive shape. Hayes leaned closer to his monitor, his breath catching as realization dawned. Emma Morrison was holding what appeared to be a human tooth, a child's tooth. The room suddenly felt colder as Hayes stared at the screen, his mind racing with the implications of this gruesome discovery hidden within what should have been an innocent family. Portrait. Hayes spent the next morning researching the Morrison family through local newspaper, archives, and county records. The Millfield County Library's digital database contained decades of local documentation, and he methodically searched for any mention of the family name around 1921. What he found made his blood run cold. In the June 15th, 1921 edition of the Millfield Weekly Herald, a small article buried on page 3 caught his attention. Local child still missing. Community continues. Search for young Timothy Baker. The article described how 5-year-old Timothy had vanished from his family's farm 3 weeks earlier. His parents, devastated wheat farmers, had organized search parties that combed the surrounding prairie for days without success. Hayes read further. Timothy had last been seen playing near the creek that bordered several properties, including the Morrison farm. The boy's disappearance had shocked the tight-knit farming community, where children typically roamed freely across the vast open spaces. A follow-up article from July 1921 revealed more disturbing details. Timothy's body had been discovered in a shallow grave near Morrison property, but the cause of death remained undetermined. The local sheriff, lacking modern forensic capabilities, had ruled it an accidental death, possibly drowning followed by animal predation. Hayes cross-referenced the dates. The Morrison family photograph was taken in summer 1921, just weeks after Timothy's body was found. If Emma was indeed holding Timothy's tooth in the photograph, it suggested something far more sinister than accidental death. He searched for more information about the Baker family. Timothy had been described as a cheerful child with distinctive front teeth, unusually large for his age, according to his mother's heartbroken testimony to the sheriff. Hayes returned to the digital photograph, zooming in once again on Emma's closed fist. The tooth appeared to be a front tooth, larger than typical for a child Emma's age. His hands trembled as he saved the enhanced image to his computer. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Emma Morrison hadn't just been present when this photograph was taken. She had been proudly displaying a trophy from what appeared to be her first kill. The next day, Hayes drove to the basement storage facility where Millfield County kept its oldest records. The building, a converted warehouse on the outskirts of town, housed decades of legal documents, police reports, and court proceedings. Most were poorly organized, stored in boxes that hadn't been touched in decades. After 3 hours of searching through dusty filing cabinets, Hayes found what he was looking for: Sheriff William Grant's complete report on Timothy Baker's death. The file was thin, containing only a few handwritten pages and several crude photographs of the crime scene. Sheriff Grant's notes revealed details never published in the local newspaper. Timothy's body had been found in a state of partial decomposition, making determination of cause of death nearly impossible with 1921 investigative techniques. However, Grant had noted several disturbing observations that troubled him enough to document privately. The child's mouth showed evidence of significant trauma, with several teeth missing. At the time, this had been attributed to decomposition and animal activity. But Grant's personal notes suggested he harbored doubts about the accidental death ruling. More significantly, Grant had interviewed neighbors about suspicious activity in the area. One farmer reported seeing Emma Morrison playing alone near the creek on multiple occasions during the weeks preceding Timothy's disappearance. Another neighbor mentioned that Emma had been observed talking to Timothy just days before he vanished. Hayes discovered that Grant had questioned Emma directly, but her parents had been present throughout the interview. According to his notes, Emma had answered questions with unusual composure for a child her age, and showed no apparent distress when discussing the deceased boy. Most chilling was Grant's final observation. The Morrison girl displayed knowledge of the victim's dental peculiarities that seems inconsistent with casual acquaintance. She specifically mentioned his big front teeth without prompting, a detail few community members would know. Grant had wanted to pursue the investigation further, but pressure from local officials, eager to close a disturbing case that was frightening families, forced him to accept the accidental death ruling. Hayes photographed every page of the report, his understanding of the Morrison family photograph taking on an even darker dimension. Armed with Sheriff Grant's suspicions, Hayes expanded his research to surrounding counties, searching for similar unexplained child deaths in the early 1920s. What he discovered over the following week painted a horrifying picture of a pattern that had gone unrecognized for over a century. Between 1921 and 1923, 7 children had died under mysterious circumstances within a 50-mile radius of the Morrison farm. The deaths had been scattered across different counties, investigated by different law enforcement agencies, ensuring that no single investigator saw the full scope of what now appeared to be a series of connected crimes. Each case shared disturbing similarities. The victims were all between ages 4 and 7, all had disappeared while playing outdoors, and all were eventually found dead with unclear causes of death. In every case, local authorities had ruled the deaths accidental, citing drowning, animal attacks, or agricultural accidents. Hayes created a timeline on his office wall, mapping the deaths chronologically. Timothy Baker in June 1921 was just the beginning. Margaret Lewis, age 6, had been found dead in a barn in August. 1921, 4-year-old David Thompson had drowned in a cattle pond in October. 1921, the pattern continued through 1922. And into early 1923, most significantly, Hayes discovered that the Morrison family had visited relatives in each county where deaths occurred, staying for extended periods during harvest seasons, when William Morrison worked as itinerant farm labor. Emma would have accompanied her family on these trips, giving her access to each area where children subsequently died. Hayes contacted descendants of the victims' families, many of whom still lived in the region. While most had only vague family stories about the tragedies, several recalled disturbing details their grandparents had whispered about. One elderly woman remembered her grandmother mentioning that Margaret Lewis had been found with something wrong with her mouth. Several teeth missing that couldn't be explained by the supposed barn accident. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Emma Morrison hadn't been responsible for just Timothy Baker's death. She had been a serial killer, methodically targeting young children across rural Kansas while her family moved from farm to farm. The tooth in the photograph was likely just one of many trophies she had collected. From her victims, Hayes knew he needed more than circumstantial evidence to support his theory. He spent days contacting elderly residents of the areas where the deaths had occurred, hoping to find someone who might remember the Morrison family's visits or unusual details about the children's deaths. His breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Agnes Parker, now 93 years old and living in a nursing home in neighboring Oakdale County. When Hayes mentioned the Morrison name during a phone call, Agnes's response was immediate and chilling. "I remember that family," she said, her voice still sharp despite her age. "Especially that little girl. There was something wrong with her." Hayes drove to the nursing home the next day. Agnes was sitting in the sunroom, her weathered hands folded in her lap, but her mind remained remarkably clear. She had been 12 years old in 1922 when the Morrison family had stayed at her uncle's farm during wheat harvest. "My mother told me to stay away from that girl," Agnes recalled. "Emma, her name was. She was younger than me, but she had these eyes, like she was always watching, always thinking. It made my skin crawl." Agnes remembered specific incidents that had disturbed the adults at the time. Emma had shown unusual interest in the farm's livestock, often found standing over dead chickens or rabbits with a fascination that unnerved the hired hands. She had asked detailed questions about how animals died, what happened to their bodies after death. "One day, I caught her behind the barn with a dead cat," Agnes continued. "She was examining it, poking at it with a stick. When she saw me watching, she smiled this horrible smile and said the cat was sleeping better now. Most significantly, Agnes remembered that during the Morrison family's stay, a neighbor's child, 6-year-old Mary Catherine, had gone missing for several hours. The girl was eventually found alive, but traumatized, hiding in the root cellar. Mary Catherine had claimed that a mean girl had tried to hurt her, but adults had dismissed this as childhood imagination. My mother believed Mary Catherine," Agnes said firmly. "She made sure we were never alone when that Morrison girl was around. There was evil in that child, and everyone felt it." Agnes's testimony provided crucial context for understanding Emma's behavior and the fear she had instilled in those who encountered her. Hayes' research led him to the most disturbing discovery yet: the last known victim in Emma Morrison's killing spree. In February 1923, 7-year-old Sarah Mitchell had disappeared from her family's farm in Butler County. Unlike the previous cases, Sarah's death had generated more detailed investigation due to the persistence of her father, a former railroad detective. James Mitchell had refused to accept the sheriff's conclusion that his daughter had fallen through ice while playing near a frozen pond. Mitchell's own investigation, documented in a private journal Hayes found in county records, revealed evidence that law enforcement had either missed or deliberately ignored. Mitchell had discovered Sarah's footprints in the snow leading away from the pond, accompanied by smaller footprints that suggested she had been walking with another child. The trail led to an abandoned grain silo on the outskirts of town, where Mitchell found disturbing evidence: Sarah's torn clothing, bloodstains, and most horrifically, 3 of her teeth arranged in a deliberate pattern on an old crate. Mitchell's journal entries detailed his growing suspicion that his daughter had been murdered by another child. He had interviewed local families about recent visitors and learned about the Morrison family's presence in the area during harvest season. Mitchell had even attempted to question Emma directly, but the family had left town abruptly before he could pursue his investigation. "The girl answered my questions with unnatural calm," Mitchell had written. When I mentioned Sarah's name, she tilted her head like a curious animal and asked if I wanted to know what Sarah looked like when she cried. The coldness in her voice chilled me to the bone." Mitchell's investigation had been cut short by his own sudden death in March 1923. Officially ruled a heart attack, though he was only 34 years old and in good health. His widow, overwhelmed by grief and suspicious circumstances, had burned most of his research, but the journal survived in county records. Hayes realized that Mitchell's death might not have been natural. If Emma's parents had become aware of his investigation, they might have taken drastic measures to protect their daughter's secret. The Morrison family's departure from Butler County had coincided perfectly with Mitchell's death. Hayes' investigation took a psychological turn as he tried to understand how Emma's parents had dealt with their daughter's murderous behavior. Through church records and school enrollment documents, he traced the Morrison family's movements after 1923, looking for patterns that might reveal how they had managed Emma's condition. What he discovered suggested a family trapped in a nightmare of their own making. After James Mitchell's investigation in Butler County, the Morrison family had abandoned their itinerant farming lifestyle and settled permanently on a remote homestead in western Kansas. School records showed that Emma had never been enrolled in formal education after 1923, despite Kansas law requiring school attendance medical. Records from the county clinic revealed that Mary Morrison had sought treatment for nervous exhaustion multiple times between 1923 and 1925. Doctor's notes, written in careful medical language, described a woman suffering from severe anxiety and what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. More telling were the family's religious activities. Church attendance records showed that William and Mary Morrison had become obsessively devout after 1923, attending services multiple times per week and making substantial donations despite their modest farming income. Hayes found letters from their pastor expressing concern about Mary's excessive confession and her repeated requests for guidance about children who are born different. Hayes discovered that the Morrison family had consulted with traveling doctors and specialists, desperately seeking explanations or treatments for Emma's behavior. One physician's report, found in a private medical collection, described an 8-year-old girl with profound antisocial tendencies and recommended permanent institutionalization. The report was dated November 1923, just months after Sarah Mitchell's death. The doctor had noted that the child showed no remorse for actions that had caused significant trauma to family members and displayed concerning fascination with death and suffering. However, institutional care for disturbed children was virtually non-existent. In rural Kansas during the 1920s, the Morrison family had been faced with an impossible choice: surrender their daughter to inadequate state facilities or attempt to manage her condition themselves. They had chosen to isolate Emma completely, essentially creating a prison on their remote homestead to protect both their daughter and potential victims. Hayes's final breakthrough came through death records and cemetery documentation. Emma Morrison had died in November 1926 at age 13, officially from pneumonia. However, the circumstances surrounding her death suggested a more complex story. Medical records showed that Emma had been in perfect health just weeks before her death. Dr. Robert Hayes, no relation to the historian, had examined her in October 1926 for a routine visit and found no signs of illness. The sudden onset of fatal pneumonia seemed suspicious, particularly given the family's desperate situation. Hayes found correspondence between Dr. Hayes and a colleague in Kansas City, discussing a most unusual case involving a disturbed child whose family faced impossible circumstances. The letters, stored in medical archives, revealed that Emma's parents had sought advice about humanitarian measures for a child who posed continuing danger to the community. More damning evidence came from pharmacy, records showing that William Morrison had purchased large quantities of laudanum and chloral hydrate. In the weeks preceding Emma's death, both substances that could be lethal in sufficient doses and could mask symptoms that might appear consistent with respiratory illness. Hayes realized that Emma's parents had likely made the ultimate sacrifice to protect other children. Faced with a daughter who showed no signs of improvement and continued to pose a threat, they had chosen to end her life quietly and mercifully. Emma was buried in the Morrison family plot in Millfield Cemetery, her grave marked only with a simple stone bearing her name and dates. Hayes visited the site, noting that her grave was separated from her parents' eventual burial sites by an unusual distance, as if they couldn't bear to rest too close to their daughter even in death. Church records from Emma's funeral revealed a small, private service attended only by immediate family. The pastor's notes described parents weighted down by sorrows too heavy for this world, and a sense that the family was finally released from a burden that had tested their faith beyond endurance. Emma Morrison's reign of terror had lasted less than 3 years, but in that time, she had claimed at least 7 young lives and destroyed multiple families, including her own. Hayes completed his research in late 2023, more than 2 years after first discovering the Morrison family photograph. His investigation had uncovered one of America's earliest documented cases of juvenile serial killing, a story that had remained hidden for over a century. The evidence was overwhelming. The photograph showing Emma clutching Timothy Baker's tooth, the pattern of child deaths following the family's movements, witness testimony about her disturbing behavior, and the family's desperate measures to contain her. Together, these elements painted an undeniable picture of a child psychopath whose crimes had been covered up by inadequate investigative methods and a community's desire to believe that such evil couldn't exist in an innocent child. Hayes faced a difficult decision about how to present his findings. The descendants of victims' families deserved to know the truth about their ancestors' deaths, but revealing Emma's crimes would also expose the Morrison family's final desperate act of infanticide. After careful consideration, he decided that historical accuracy demanded full disclosure. He published his findings in the Journal of Criminal History, titling his article "Hidden in Plain Sight: The Morrison Family Photograph and America's Youngest Serial Killer." The article included the enhanced digital image showing Emma's macabre trophy, alongside comprehensive documentation of his 2-year investigation. The publication sparked national interest in the case, with criminologists and historians praising Hayes's meticulous research methods. More importantly, it brought closure to families who had carried questions about their ancestors' deaths for generations. At the Millfield County Historical Society, Hayes created a permanent exhibit about the case, including the original Morrison photograph, alongside documentation of his investigation. The exhibit serves as both historical education and warning, a reminder that evil can hide behind the most innocent appearances. The Morrison family photograph, once a seemingly happy portrait of rural American life, now serves as evidence of one of the most disturbing crimes in Kansas history. Emma Morrison's secret smile, frozen in time for over a century, finally tells its complete and terrible story. In her small hand, she clutches not just a child's tooth, but proof of humanity's capacity for evil regardless of age or appearance.